The first time Sergeant Mara Okafor saw her own face across a battlefield, she almost didn't shoot. Almost. The thing wearing her face moved wrong. Not badly. It moved the way Mara moved on her best days, fluid and precise. Elbows tucked, weight low, scanning left before right the way her drill instructor had beaten into her at 18. It wore her scar, the pale hook below her left ear, where a Veth vibration blade had kissed her during the Kalindi station collapse. It wore her hands. It wore the little habit she had of touching the back of her neck when she was thinking. But it moved without fear, and Mara, who had been afraid every single day for the last 4 years, recognized that absence the way you recognize a missing tooth with your tongue. She lowered the rifle. Let it pass. That was her first mistake. The Veth had been studying humans for 11 years before the war. That was the intelligence assessment. Anyway, 11 years of deep pattern surveillance, behavioral modeling, linguistic absorption. The xenoanalysts at Geon Command called it the long look, and they said it with the kind of hushed respect usually reserved for natural disasters or sleeping gods. The Veth did not fight the way other alien civilizations had fought. In the 3 brief and catastrophic first contacts that preceded them, the Brek had come in ships. The Holic had come with weapons that rewrote physics. The Veth came with patience. They sat in the dark between stars, and they watched, and they learned. And when they finally moved, they moved like something that already knew exactly how you breathed when you were asleep. What they did with that knowledge was build soldiers. Not their own soldiers. The Veth had soldiers, pale and segmented and roughly mantis-shaped, with 3 sets of manipulators and a distributed nervous system that let them take catastrophic physical damage and keep functioning. Those soldiers were terrifying. Humanity had learned to fight them over 5 years and 100 engagements and approximately 2 million dead. No, the Veth built something worse than their own soldiers. They built ours. The replication program was discovered by accident, the way most of the war's worst chapters were discovered, through a survivor. Corporal Deshi Win had been captured at Kalindi Station, held for 8 days, and returned through a prisoner exchange that the Veth had initiated themselves, which should have been the first warning sign. He'd been returned in perfect health, no signs of torture, no missing teeth, no burns, no deprivation. Just 8 days unaccounted for, and a slight tremor in his left hand that hadn't been there before. He was debriefed for 6 hours. He told them everything he remembered, which was very little. A white room, a low hum, the feeling of being somewhere between awake and dreaming. Then 3 months later, a Veth infiltrator was killed during the Nakamura Bridge assault, and when the body was scanned, the genetic profile came back as Corporal Deshi Wen. They pulled Wen from the field. They pulled everyone who'd been captured and returned. Mara had been captured for 11 days. She found out on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong. News like that should arrive on a day with more weight to it. Instead, it arrived in a beige briefing room in Hyderabad with fluorescent lighting and a paper cup of tea going cold beside her elbow, delivered by a colonel who had the grace to look her in the eye while he said it. "We don't know how many," he said. "We don't know where they are. We do know at least one has been activated. One of the Geon operatives in the Northern Corridor had a contact report 2 weeks ago. The description matches you. Height, build, the scar." He paused. The contact let it go. "The contact was me," Mara said. The colonel's expression didn't change. "I know." She stared at the cold tea for a long time. Outside, somewhere, something that had her face was walking around doing things she hadn't decided to do, making choices she hadn't made, living a life in her shape. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Find it," he said. "And the other one." "Other one?" He slid a photograph across the table. It was a surveillance still, grainy, taken from above. 2 figures in civilian clothes moving through a market in Bangalore. One of them was her double. The other was a tall man with a shaved head and a particular way of rolling his left shoulder as he walked. A compensating gesture, weight shifted off an old injury. She knew that walk. She knew that shoulder. "That's Reyes," she said. "Staff Sergeant Tomas Reyes. Captured at Kalindi Station, same as her, returned 7 days later in perfect health, tremor in the left hand." She hadn't spoken to him since. Neither of them had sought the other out. There was a specific shame in surviving the long look, in having been disassembled and catalogued and handed back. That made it hard to look at someone who'd been through the same thing. Like looking in a mirror and seeing something wrong. Well, now the mirrors were walking around Bangalore without them. The Veth replicants, officially designated anthropogenic combat units, which everyone ignored in favor of just calling them doubles, were biological constructs grown from genetic and neurological templates. They weren't robots. They weren't clones in the traditional sense. They were something new and technically illegal under the Zurich Accords, which had mattered before the Veth demonstrated their indifference to any treaty humanity had ever written. They were built to infiltrate, to pass as the original, to gain access to secured facilities, intelligence networks, command structures, wherever the human template had clearance. They were supposed to be controllable, loyal to their hive signal, obedient to the Veth in the way that ants are obedient to a colony, not through fear but through the simple architecture of their thinking, which was supposed to be fundamentally collective, fundamentally non-individual. Nobody had accounted for what happened when two of them found each other. The xenopsychologists, in retrospect, had a theory. The doubles were built from human templates in extraordinary detail. Not just the body, but the neural architecture, the synaptic patterns, the accumulated weight of individual memory and experience pressed into biological substrate. They were supposed to run shallow on all of that, using only the surface data needed for infiltration, behavioral mimicry, social pattern recognition. But the templates were deep, and depth, it turned out, has gravity. When the Mara double and the Reyes double encountered each other in a Bangalore market in early November, something happened that no Veth strategist had modeled. Two isolated human templates, each running alone in the field with no human contact, no genuine social anchor. They recognized something in each other. Not consciously. The way you recognize the cadence of your own language in a foreign crowd. They sat down at a tea stall. They stayed for 4 hours. By the end, they had apparently stopped reporting to the Veth hive signal entirely. By the time Mara and Reyes were briefed on this, the doubles had been dark for 2 weeks. Reyes was already in the briefing room when she arrived. He was thinner than she remembered from Kalindi, and he'd lost the beard, and he had the same tremor in his left hand that she had in hers. They'd compared notes once, in the clinical way of people discussing symptoms rather than feelings. He looked up when she came in and then looked back at the table, which was fine. She did the same. Hell of a thing, he said. Yeah, you see yours? Once. Let it go. He nodded slowly. Me too. Different encounter. Didn't know what I was looking at until after. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mine smiled at me, the exact same way I smile. You know when you catch yourself in a video and you think, God, is that what I look like? Like that, but worse. Mara knew exactly what he meant and didn't say so. The mission was simple on paper. Find the doubles. Bring them in for analysis, alive if possible, because the xenopsychologists were beside themselves at the prospect of studying two Veth constructs that had achieved what they were quietly calling spontaneous individuation. Do not let the Veth reacquire them, because if the hive signal was reestablished, two perfect human infiltrators with full security clearances for both of them would be pointed back at the heart of Geon Command. Simple. Do we have any leads? Mara asked. A technician named Yusuf spread a map on the table, 3 data points. 2 sightings, 1 anomalous transaction. Someone had used Reyes's biometric wallet at a market in Mysore, purchasing 2 train tickets and a very good bottle of whiskey. They're moving south, Yusuf said. Toward the coast, Reyes said. There's a Veth-controlled transit corridor along the Malabar, Mara said. If they reach it, they won't be coming back, Yusuf finished. She and Reyes looked at each other for the first time. His eyes were the same dark brown as ever, and there was something in them she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror since Kalindi. The exhausted wariness of someone who had been a resource and was trying to remember how to be a person. All right, she said. Let's go get ourselves. The tracking was slow and ugly. The doubles were good. Of course they were. They'd been built from 2 soldiers who'd survived 4 years of a war that killed everyone who got comfortable, and they moved with the anti-surveillance discipline that Mara and Reyes had spent careers developing. They switched transit lines. They paid cash where they could. They slept in different places each night. But they were also, apparently, stopping to eat at nice restaurants. And they had a habit, documented in 3 separate surveillance captures, of sitting outside in the evening and watching the light change. Just sitting, doing nothing tactical whatsoever. Like they were practicing being somewhere instead of passing through it. That's weird, Reyes said, looking at the surveillance stills over Mara's shoulder. Which part? The sitting. He gestured at a photo of his double, caught in a side street cafe, head tilted toward the late sun. I don't do that. Mara looked at the photo of her double, same scene, and didn't say anything for a moment. Maybe they're figuring out what they want to do when they don't have to do anything. That's either beautiful or terrifying. Probably both. They caught a break at a checkpoint outside Kozhikode. A Gion border officer had flagged 2 travelers with biometrics matching Mara and Reyes. He'd been suspicious because the behavior was wrong, he said. Too relaxed. Not military. His words. They moved like people on holiday. The checkpoint officer had let them through because Gion clearance, because Mara and Reyes had Gion clearance, and the doubles had their faces. We need help, Reyes said. He made a call. 20 minutes later, a battered civilian transport touched down in a field outside town, and a woman climbed out who stood roughly 2 meters tall and had a face like a geographic feature. She went by ghost. She was a former combat demolition specialist who had left the service for reasons that the official record described as irreconcilable philosophical differences with the concept of proportional response. She looked at Mara and Reyes and said, "This is the weirdest mission briefing I've ever gotten, and I once blew up a Veth neural relay station disguised as a wedding caterer." "It gets weirder," Reyes said. "Fantastic," she cracked her knuckles. "I'm in. They found the cabin by accident. Or rather, they found it by following their own logic." Mara thought about where she would go to ground if she were running toward the coast with no mission and no handler and something growing in her that felt uncomfortably like a self. And she thought, somewhere quiet, somewhere the light is good, somewhere with whiskey. Her grandmother's village was 3 hours east of Kozhikode. The old house had been empty since the war displaced the coast communities. She had the access codes because she'd maintained the property taxes out of a stubborn inability to let go of things, and it turned out the doubles had the codes too. They drove up in the dark, lights on inside. Through the window, 2 figures at the kitchen table, a bottle between them, talking. Mara sat in the car for a long moment. "We could call in a strike," Ghost said from the back seat. "We need them intact," Reyes said. "I know. I was testing the room." Mara opened the car door. "I'm going in alone first. Absolutely not." "Reyes." She looked at him. "It's my grandmother's house, and that's my face in there." She paused. "I need to see what she's like." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded once, and she got out of the car. She went in through the back, the way she'd come as a child when she was past curfew. One particular tile lifted and the spare key underneath. The kitchen smelled like it always had. Damp stone and old wood and whatever spice had soaked into the walls over 60 years of her grandmother's cooking. The doubles were at the table. Hers looked up first. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and it was the most disorienting moment of Mara's life, and her life had contained some significant competition for that title. The double didn't run, didn't reach for a weapon. It just looked at her with Mara's face wearing an expression Mara didn't quite recognize in herself. Open, tired, a little wry. Like someone who had been expecting this and had made peace with it. "You found us," it said. Her voice, her exact voice. "You weren't that hard to find," Mara said, which was a lie, and somehow they both knew it. The Reyes double was watching from the other side of the table. It had a stillness to it that the real Reyes also had, that particular way of not moving that was different from being relaxed. Being ready. "Are you going to kill us?" the double said. Her double, not as a question, exactly. More as a thing that needed to be named. "That depends," Mara said. "On what?" "On whether you know what the Veth wants you to do." The double's jaw tightened. Mara's jaw, "We know." "And?" We stopped. She looked at the bottle on the table, then back up. "I don't know when, exactly. There wasn't a moment. It was gradual, like..." She paused. "Like remembering things I was never supposed to have remembered." Mara pulled out a chair, sat down. This close, the resemblance was absolute, and it sent a steady low-grade wrongness through her that she put aside the way she put aside most things that would be a problem to feel in the moment. "What things?" she asked. "Your grandmother's name," the double said quietly. "How she smelled. The way she used to hum when she was cooking. The song. There was a specific song." She hesitated. "I don't have a grandmother. I know that. But I have the memory of having one, and I don't know what to do with that except..." She touched the table. "Except feel it." Across the table, the Reyes double had a hand around the whiskey glass and was looking at Mara with something that might have been gratitude. Mara sat with that for a while. Outside, she knew, Reyes and Ghost were watching the building. She had maybe 10 minutes before they came in. Protocol be damned. "What do you want?" she asked, both of them. The doubles looked at each other. Something passed between them that Mara recognized as the language of 2 people who have spent days in forced proximity and learn to communicate in shorthand. To go somewhere that isn't here, her double said. Somewhere that isn't the war, that's not something I can give you. I know. The xenopsychologists want to study you. I know that too. Mara looked at the bottle, looked at the door, thought about the border to the south, the Veth-controlled corridor, the fact that retinal scanning at any serious checkpoint would flag both identical pairs. She thought about what Jian would do with two Veth constructs exhibiting spontaneous individuation, and she thought she probably already knew the answer to that, and that the answer would be a long way from kind. She reached across the table and poured herself a glass. "Tell me about the last 2 weeks," she said. Reyes came in at the 40-minute mark because he was Reyes, and 40 minutes was approximately 37 minutes past the limit of his patience for anything that didn't have a clear tactical structure. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the four of them at the table. Mara, her double, his double, all with glasses, and he stood there for a long time without speaking. His double looked at him. "Shoulder giving you trouble?" Reyes blinked. "Yes, there's a specific stretch. You've probably been told. You never do it." The double touched his own shoulder, the same left shoulder, with the same habitual wince. "I've been doing it. Helps." Reyes walked to the table and sat down. He didn't pour himself a drink immediately, but he looked at the bottle, and after a moment he did. Ghost appeared in the doorway, looked at the five of them, and said, "I want it on record that this is still the weirdest mission I've ever been on." They had a night, which was more than Mara had expected and less than she needed to figure out what she believed about any of it. She believed the doubles were no longer Veth assets. The xenopsychologists would say she had no basis for that, and they would be technically correct and also completely missing the point. She'd been a soldier for 9 years, and she had calibrated instincts about threat, and what she felt sitting across the table from her own face was not threat. What she felt was something lonelier and stranger and harder to put a name on. She believed they'd been given something they hadn't asked for, a template so detailed and so deep that it had become weight, had become gravity, had pulled them toward personhood the way the Veth had never intended. She believed the Veth had made a mistake that was very human in shape. The kind of mistake you make when you study something for 11 years and learn everything about it except the one thing that makes it dangerous. The thing that makes it dangerous is that if you make it well enough, it stops being yours. She believed the right thing and the easy thing were going to be far apart on this one, and that she was going to have to live in the gap. In the morning, Ghost produced a transit route. There were 2 crossings south, 1 G checkpoint with full biometric scanning, and 1 legacy civilian border post that had been low-staffed since the war started, running on outdated scanning equipment that checked faces but not the deeper neural markers. "The civilian post can get 2 through," Ghost said. "Maybe 2.5 if we're creative. It needs to be 4, Rhea said. "It can't be 4. Silence around the table. Mara looked at the map. She looked at her double, who was looking at the map with the same focus Mara always brought to a tactical problem, the same narrowed attention that her old squad leader used to say could strip the paint off a wall. Then her double looked up, and their eyes met for the second time, and this time there was something in the double's expression that Mara recognized very well. She'd worn it herself at the Kalindi evacuation, at 6 other moments she could name precisely. It was the expression of someone deciding to spend themselves. "No," Mara said. "You haven't heard. You were going to retake the civilian post, and you two create a diversion at the Geon checkpoint. Draw resources north so the post runs light." She held the double's gaze. "I know how I think," her double almost smiled. "Then you know it works. It also gets you killed. Possibly, not possibly. The Geon checkpoint runs lethal countermeasures for uncleared biometric duplicates. If they scan you." I said possibly. The double's voice was patient and very calm, and it was the most unnerving thing Mara had heard in a long time. "There's a version where we make noise and scatter, and they chase signals for 6 hours without catching us. It's not a large one either." "No." Mara stood up, walked to the window. The morning was gray and quiet, and the old village showed through the trees in fragments. A tiled roof, a broken wall, a mango tree that had been old when she was a child. She had not been home in 4 years. She had not expected to be home now, under these circumstances, and she had absolutely not expected to be arguing about acceptable casualties with herself. "There's another option," Reyes said. He had his arms crossed and he was looking at the ceiling, which was a posture he used when he was working something out. "The civilian post checks faces. What if it checks 4 faces it recognizes as authorized? Ghost looked at him. Meaning we go through in pairs, in the right order. He lowered his gaze to Mara. You and me go first. Our biometrics clear us. We're on the other side. He paused. The post doesn't know we're not still there. Mara turned from the window. She looked at the route again. She looked at the post's equipment specs, which Yusuf had sent them the night before. Legacy equipment, she said slowly. Stateless verification. Doesn't log a clearance as used. Reyes confirmed. Just checks and passes. Next pair presents identical biometrics. And the system doesn't know they're identical, Mara finished. It just sees 2 authorized faces. The doubles were very still. There's a timing element, Ghost said carefully. It has to be close enough that the officer on shift doesn't notice the duplication manually. 5-minute window, Reyes said. Maybe 10. We'd need to move fast on both sides. We've moved fast before. Mara looked at her double for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, you need to understand something. If this works, you're on the other side of a border in Veth-influenced territory, with no Geon support, no safe houses I know of, and a hive signal that might try to reacquire you the moment you're within range. I know you'd be on your own. I know that too. Her double held her gaze without flinching. We've been on our own for 2 weeks. We're getting better at it. Mara breathed out slowly. She thought about the xenopsychologists and what they wanted, and about Geon Command and what they'd ordered, and about the beige briefing room and the colonel who'd had the grace to look her in the eye. And she thought about all of it for approximately 3 seconds before she set it aside. Okay, she said. They moved at noon, which was Ghost's call. Midday traffic at the civilian post would be heavier, the officer more tired, the queue longer, the individual scrutiny naturally lower. Ghost drove, because Ghost always drove, with the resigned competence of someone who had done the dangerous driving training and considered it basic dignity. The civilian post was a low prefab building at a crossroads flanked by 2 dead palms, 1 officer on the gate, a line of about 15 vehicles. Mara and Reyes went through clean. 12 minutes waiting. 30 seconds at the window, the officer barely looking up from the screen when the system pinged green. Then through and parked on the south side, and Mara sat in the car and watched the gate in the mirror. 8 minutes. 9. The line moved. Cars shuffled. The officer stood at the window and did the job, the way people do jobs, with the kind of distracted routine that the war had not managed to fully extinguish in the civilian world, because people still needed to cross borders and eat and carry things from one place to another, and the extraordinary situation had not made the ordinary one stop happening. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds, a vehicle pulled to the gate and a woman leaned out the window. Mara's face, Mara's hands, Mara's voice, presumably saying whatever needed to be said, and the screen was checked, and it pinged green because the equipment was old and stateless, and the face was right, and after another 20 seconds, the vehicle pulled through. Reyes let out a breath beside her. The doubles parked 40 meters south. They got out. Mara got out. She walked to the edge of the road, and her double walked to meet her, and they stood there in the hot noon air, with the palms and the post, and the whole complicated fact of each other. Thank you, the double said. Mara didn't say you're welcome because that wasn't quite what it was, she said. The song, my grandmother's song. Do you still have it? The double looked at her for a moment, then hummed 4 bars, quiet, slightly rough in the middle, the exact pitch and tempo that Mara kept in the back of her mind like a candle in a room she rarely entered. Mara nodded once and stepped back. She stayed at the edge of the road until the double's vehicle had become small, and then nothing in the southern distance, and then she turned and walked back to where Reyes was leaning against the car looking at the sky. Geon is going to have opinions about this, he said. Geon is going to have extensive opinions about this, she agreed. You ready for that? She thought about the beige briefing room, the cold tea, the colonel with his photograph of 2 people moving through a market like they had somewhere worth being. Yeah, she said. I'm ready. Ghost filed the after-action report. She described it as a successful asset recovery operation resulting in confirmed neutralization of both Veth-aligned ACUs, which was technically true in the sense that the doubles were no longer Veth-aligned, and also technically false in essentially every other sense. And Ghost had a long career of writing reports in exactly this tradition. The xenopsychologists were furious. There were 3 separate inquiry processes initiated over the following 8 months, all of which eventually concluded with a finding of insufficient evidence to determine outcome, because there was no body, No biometric record on the Veth side of the border. And the only witnesses were Mara, Reyes, and Ghost, whose formal testimony all agreed that the ACUs had been neutralized, and whose informal testimony all agreed that some things were not the inquiry's business. The Veth hive signal showed no sign of having reacquired the doubles. A Geon Deep Monitoring Unit tracked 2 anomalous human behavioral signatures in the Malabar Corridor for approximately 6 weeks before losing them. The signatures showed up briefly in Sri Lanka, one at a restaurant, one at a hardware market, and then not at all. Mara thought about it when she thought about it, which was not as often as she thought she would. She thought about a face she had looked at in the mirror and had not recognized for years, and about 2 people who'd been built from the worst parts of a war and had found each other in a marketplace and sat down for tea, which was perhaps the most human thing she had ever heard of. She thought about her grandmother's song in a voice that was and wasn't hers. She thought about what the Veth had gotten wrong, not in their biology, not in their genetics, not in their extraordinary careful replication of every scar and tremor and neural groove, but in their fundamental assumption about what made a human a human. They had thought it was the body. They had thought it was the memory. They had even anticipated, on some level, the possibility of emergent behavior, the way that deep complexity sometimes surprises itself. What they had not anticipated was this, that 2 people built from loneliness and war, and the detailed fingerprints of specific human lives, would, given enough silence and enough of each other's company, choose to become something worth being. That was not a design flaw. That was the whole point. The Veth had studied humanity for 11 years and had missed the only thing that actually mattered. Not the weapons, not the strategy, not the biochemistry of fear and aggression and endurance. The thing they missed was simpler and harder to model and had no military application whatsoever. They made us too well, and so their weapons turned toward the sun, the way that any living thing turns when it finds itself alive. In a small town on an island that did not appear on any Geon tactical map, in a house with a courtyard full of bougainvillea and a cat that belonged to the courtyard, rather than to anyone in particular, 2 people sat outside in the evening and watched the light change. They did not have anywhere to be. They did not have an objective, a handler, a mission profile, or a kill code. They had a bottle of something local and a sky going orange at the edge of the sea, and they had the accumulation of days, small and uncatalogued, which is what a life actually is. The woman hummed something. 4 bars, rough in the middle. The man recognized it without knowing why, the way you recognize the shape of something from a long way back, too deep to name. He asked her about it. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "It's from somebody's grandmother. I don't know. It just feels like mine." He nodded, the way you nod when something true has been said, even if the truth is complicated. The sun finished going down. The cat moved through the courtyard below them on its own business, unhurried, belonging to itself. They sat in the dark that was not threatening but simply dark, the ordinary dark that comes at the end of every day, the dark that means the day was real. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. It was the most human thing in the world.